Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sarah Willie LeBreton. I use she, her pronouns. And I have recently become the president of Smith College. I'm delighted to welcome you today as we honor the connections between one of Smith's most influential alums, Gloria Steinem, the feminist movement, which is just as important today as it was 50 years ago, and Ms. Magazine, which has been a central voice for the women's movement since its inception. From its founding, Smith College and its students, faculty, staff, and alums have been united in their commitment to build a more inclusive, sustainable, and just world. One need look no further than the work of Gloria Steinem, Smith College alum from the class of 1956, to know that this is true. Through her writing, speeches, and activism, Gloria has inspired generations of women and men, has inspired generations of people to look at the world differently and to fight for women's equality. How fortunate Smith is, then, to hold Gloria's papers within our special collections. The correspondence, writings, speeches, subject files, memorabilia, and photographs in the collection document the women's movement from multiple perspectives, including the founding of Ms. Magazine, now celebrating its 50th anniversary. When I had the opportunity to meet Gloria Steinem this summer, she said, "It makes me so glad that Smith is becoming the place it was not for me, and that I hoped it would." It is a remarkable collection that we have in our archives, and I'm so pleased that it is available for viewing in the Steinem Reading Room on the 3rd floor of Nielsen Library. The collection reflects the women, the feeling, the bonds, and the energy that were necessary to launch and sustain that phase of the women's movement and Ms. Magazine. In a recent Boston Globe article, Smith College professor Loretta Ross described Ms. as quote-unquote connective tissue. And she noted that it was so popular that there were projects to get Ms. Magazine into women's prisons. Good journalism, and especially the solutions and feminist journalism that is the hallmark of Ms. Magazine, is vital for our progress. It shares the truths of underreported stories and communities. It shares the truths of those excluded from mainstream media. And solutions journalism reports on potential paths forward that inspire us into action. The symbiotic relationship between Smith College and Ms. Magazine has been and continues to be important and vibrant. Smith faculty and students are regular magazine contributors, and Ms. articles are discussed often in Smith classrooms. Together, we are building students' writing skills, reporting necessary stories, and sustaining a women's movement now more explicitly diverse than ever, that is ongoing. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Professor Carrie Baker. Carrie is a scholar, lawyer, teacher, and activist who has spent her career in support of women's rights. She holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Yale University and a law degree, as well as a PhD in women's studies from Emory University. Carrie is a regular contributing editor at Ms., whose work appears in the 50 Years of Ms. anthology. Devoted to public writing, I learned today that Carrie has written nearly 400 articles for Ms. over the past 12 years. She is an expert on women's rights law and policy with specialties in sexual violence and reproductive rights. She currently serves as a Sylvia Dlugosch Bauman Professor of American Studies and a Professor of Women and Gender Studies here at Smith College. She serves as co-chair of the Ms. Committee of Scholars, which guides the magazine. It is a pleasure to be with you all, and I invite Carrie to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, President Willie LeBreton. Really, really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. It's so thrilling to see this auditorium so full of people who love Ms. Magazine, because I also love Ms. Magazine. So in December of 1971, when Ms. Magazine was launched as a one-off sample insert in New York Magazine, syndicated columnist James J. Kilpatrick likened the magazine to a, and I quote, C-sharp on an untuned piano, with a note of, and I quote, petulance, of bitchiness, or nervous fingernails screeching across a blackboard. When the first regular issue of Ms. hit the newsstands in July of 1972, and I'll add, sold out overnight, 300,000 copies, ABC News anchor Harry Reasoner said, "I'll give it 6 months before they run out of things to say." 50 years later, Ms. Magazine, well, yeah. But he apologized for that later, actually. He realized he was wrong. Ms. Magazine is 50 years later. We're celebrating a half century of publication with this new book that you all received today, 50 Years of Ms., the best of the pathfinding magazine that ignited a revolution. So the current editor, I know, had a really hard time selecting the pieces that are in here, because this could have been a 5-volume set easily. There have been so many amazing people that have written for the magazine over the last 50 years. And as President Willie LeBreton mentioned, we use these are now classic pieces of writing. They are archival pieces. I think of Johnny Tillman's Welfare is a Women's Issue. The different people that published in this magazine, Angela Davis, Alice Walker, Margaret Atwood. We were just in the archives, and we had an archives open house, and Leslie Fields, in the archives, put out a folder of an article submitted by Margaret Atwood that was rejected. And then there was one by Alice Walker that was rejected. But then there was one next to it of a piece she wrote that was accepted. And so, of course, we had, In Our Mother's Gardens, it came out first in Ms. So it's fascinating. I encourage you, I know a lot of you are local, to go on in there and read the archives, because they're really amazing. Before we start, could people raise their hands if you've written for Ms. Magazine? Raise your hands high. We have a fair number of people, yeah. So raise them really high. We have some of our students. Yeah, Max, stand up, actually. Stand up. Barbara, Finland, and Kristen, yeah. Lisa Fontes. Yes, so we have a lot of Ms. writers here in the community. And by the way, I'm always recruiting people. So if you want to write for Ms. Magazine, come and talk to me, because we are always looking for smart feminist writers and people that have their finger on the pulse of the movement. Because Ms. is a magazine for the movement. It is a magazine of the movement. And we report on what the movement is doing, and we help promote the issues of the women's movement. So if you are on the front line somewhere and you want to report on what's happening, let us know. We want to hear from you. So we have a couple folks that actually worked at Ms. Magazine in the 80s and the 90s as editors. Right here, Barbara Finland, and Kristen Golden, who was Gloria's assistant. Yeah, who lived right here in Amherst. Yeah. Yeah. So this group is full of lots of and many of you have come up and said, I got the first issue, and it blew my mind. How many got the first issue or some of the early issues? Yeah, a lot of hands. And I know you all have great stories, because I've been hearing them, and what an impact Ms. made on you. I know for people living in remote areas, it was like a lifeline. It was when you thought you were crazy, you read Ms. and you realized, oh, it's not me, it's the world. And you found your people. And so that was certainly what it was for me. And it's been, that's why I write so much for them. because I feel like it's the one place that, I can send an article somewhere to mainstream media and they're like, no, not interested, or too feminist. And then I go to Ms. and they're like, yes, we love this, we'll publish it. So it just works well for me. So we have this wonderful panel, and I thought I would start by introducing you and asking I'm going to ask each of you after the introduction to say, to tell me, when did you first encounter Ms. Magazine and what has it meant to you as a feminist? So I'll just go down the row, and so I'm going to give a short introduction of each person and have you answer that question. So first, to my right is Carmen Rios, who is the digital consulting editor at Ms. Magazine, producer of the 50 Years of Ms. book tour, and former managing digital editor for the magazine. She was my editor for a bunch of years. She was a wonderful, incredible editor. It was early in my writing career, and I always buried my lead, and she'd always say, here, I just made a few tweaks, and I'm like, oh my God, you made it so much better. So I learned a whole lot from Carmen. She is a feminist writer, broadcaster, and community builder whose pieces on queerness, gender, race, and class have been published by, and then there's a long list, a lot of places. And she also has produced and hosted the popular feminist podcasts, Propaganda, I love that, and The Bossy Show, which is well named for Carmen, in a good way. And her work has been covered by outlets like NPR and CNN and New York Times and Washington Post and on and on. So Carmen, so great to have you here at Smith. And tell me, when did you first encounter Ms. And yesterday I called Smith Ms. University. So, I'm mixing it all up. So when did you first encounter Ms. and what does it mean to you as a feminist?
Is it not working? It's working. Okay. I think I first encounter Ms. in college, or I guess when I'm looking for colleges. I end up going to American University, and I have a distinct memory that one of the reasons I chose to go there is because I visited the campus, and they had a really big feminist presence on campus, multiple feminist groups, and there was a feminist group called Women's Initiative handing out free issues of Ms. and all this other feminist swag. And I thought to myself, surely no other campus has a feminist club like this. And applied their early decision and ended up going there and running Women's Initiative by the time I graduated. We were in DC. Ms. has the Feminist Majority Foundation, which publishes it, has their offices in DC. And so there was just a relationship there that turned into me interning and later on me becoming an editor and working with them. There's always a joke that once you're in, you never get out. And so, and I think there's so much synergy there that just one of the first things I did at that internship was work on a study Ms. did in, I guess it would have been 2008 or 2009, about women's studies and how many campuses had it and what the programs were like and how many PhDs there were. And so basically the story ends with, I come to AU because of Ms. And by the end of my first year, I dropped my business major and became a women's studies major.
To add that Ms. has a campus organizing program. They have students on a lot of campuses, and they recruit them around election time to get students registered to vote and vote. And I think it made a big, and it was feminist majority, I guess, which owns Ms., but I think it made a big difference in the last election, and it is going to make a big difference in the next election, because young people's votes are critical. And some states are trying to prevent young people from voting, and so we have to work to help them vote. And Ms. is covering that issue very closely and really connects with the importance of young people for the magazine. So our next panelist is none other than the Loretta Ross, who really needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. Loretta is a professor in the program for the study of women and gender here at Smith, and we just feel so excited to have her here. She is a recent MacArthur Genius Award winner. Yeah. Yeah. This could be a really long introduction, but I'm going to make it short. She's an activist, educator, author, and is a co-founder of the sister song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective and the co-creator of the theory of reproductive justice. Professor Ross has traveled the world at the invitation of leaders and activists to speak about reproductive justice, and she is a regular writer for Ms. Magazine. So Loretta, when did you first encounter Ms. and why what impact has it made on you?
I wish I could remember back that far. I don't know, am I on? Now I'm on? Now I'm on. I really wish I could remember back that far, but it was close to the beginning of the 50 years. And the reason it's in the brain fog is not only because I had a good time in the 60s, but I was lucky enough in the 70s to be the third executive director of the first rape crisis center in this country. And there were few places we could write about rape and sexual assault against women. And so I don't remember being introduced to Ms., but I do remember being damn happy it existed because we were up against, establishing the first rape protocols, how cops should act, how medical providers should act, how should women be believed in telling their stories. We were naming things that we take for granted now, like stalking and childhood sexual violence and stuff. We were too busy so I don't remember a part of my feminist career when Ms. wasn't there. The other thing I want to say is that Ms. was one of the few places where we did have to fight to get the stories of women of color told. That it wasn't one of those places where we had to explain why it was important to tell the story, for example, of sexual assault through a racial lens as well as a gender lens, or why sterilization abuse was happening to us when white women had to get psychologically approved to have a voluntary sterilization. I mean, we were able to bring those threads together. And then I had a couple of intimate interactions with Ms. other than occasionally writing. And that was, in 1985, I started working for Ellie Smil at Now. And started her Women of Color program there. And so getting up front with like the premier women's organization, that was when I first met Gloria and, all the leading feminists I used to admire. And I was like, oh, they come through our offices all the time. Cool, And so I was there when she bought Ms. And I met Kathy Spillar and Kathy Bonk and, all the OGs, we kind of hung out together. And so my second most intimate contact with Ms. was when Marcia Gillespie was the editor, a black woman, for those of you who don't know and remember. And the Webster decision had just come out in 1989. And I got this call from Donna Brazile saying, we got to do something about this, because it was, not only deforming abortion rights, but restoring a lot of control back to the states and stuff. And she said, we need to do a black women's speak out or something about this. And so Donna got in touch with Marcia, and then next thing we know, we had organized a brochure called We Remember. And Faye Waddleton was president of Planned Parenthood at the time, and so we ended up printing about 250,000 copies of the first black women's statement on abortion. And Marcia Gillespie wrote the statement. That's why I'm bringing her in. Marcia wrote the statement of We Remember. And that was a pretty significant shift in black women organizing to support abortion rights. And Ms. played a role in all of that. So those are the moments I remember.
Loretta. Ms. had cover stories on issues that the mainstream media wouldn't cover, like sexual harassment. They had the first cover story on sexual harassment, the first cover story on domestic violence. Do you remember that issue with the woman with a black eye? I mean, it was monumental. The first story on date rape. They often helped coin terms or promote terms right after they were coined that became things that we all know now, like acquaintance rape or date rape. They promoted issues like the We Had Abortions petition, where 50 prominent women listed their name in Ms. Magazine saying that they had had abortions. This was an issue you would not at the time even speak about, much less admit that you had had one. And so they were courageous. They were doing these things that, and partly because they were so connected to the women's movement, but mainstream magazines and media wouldn't even touch these issues at the time. It was critical. So our next panelist is my wonderful colleague. We grew up as Ms. Writers together because we both took the Ms. Writers workshop in 2010, and we're like, are we really going to do this? Are we really going to become Ms. Writers? And here we are all these years later, both spending a whole lot of time writing for Ms. So Professor Janelle Hobson is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Albany. Her most recent book is When God Lost Her Tongue, Historical Consciousness and the Black Feminist Imagination. Professor Hobson has authored several cover stories for Ms. Magazine, including Beyonce's Fierce Feminism, which I think she's going to tell us about. And she's also the editor of the Tubman 200, the Harriet Tubman Bicentennial Project, which was an amazing project, and it was very much connected to Ms. Magazine as well. So can you tell us when you first encountered Ms. and why, what it has meant for you as a feminist?
Okay, thank you, Carrie, for that introduction. And also, so yes, we did come through Ms. together, but also we are also alumni of Emory University. So we also came through that Women's Studies PhD program as well. So we have our connections. So, and of course, when Carrie's like, do you want to be part of this panel? I was like, okay, sure. So here I am. Yeah, absolutely. So here I am. And to answer your question, my background is very similar to Carmen. You know, I also encountered Ms. Magazine when I was an undergraduate student in college. And if I'm dating myself, well, actually, I can date myself because I'm as old as Ms. Yeah. Old as Ms., old as hip hop, you know. I got all these markers for this year. But yes, when I was an undergraduate, college freshman, that was around 1991. So what was interesting to me is that around that time, I was just starting to become politically conscious. So seeing a Ms. Magazine, which was free in my dorm. Yes, in my dorm, yes, I actually saw a copy. That's how I got introduced. It really was eye-opening for me because I hadn't seen a magazine like that, and especially addressing issues of feminism. And this is around the time when that year we were dealing with Anita Hill coming forward, and the way we were having these just ridiculous conversations on campus, especially around issues of race and whether or not we were going to do racial solidarity, even though everybody didn't care for Clarence Thomas, and not enough people believed Anita Hill, which is why we are in the predicament that we are in. But that's a whole other conversation. Including our current president. We could go back, but obviously that was a time when I think Ms. Magazine was so crucial for my own feminist development and needed to have that voice because I wasn't always hearing a feminist voice, especially not just with the Anita Hill sexual harassment issues that came forward with the Supreme Court hearing. There was also the Rodney King video that came out. So all of that informed, like I said, a racial consciousness, but the feminist consciousness I really had to develop. So Ms. Magazine really helped with that. And so that is kind of like my memory. It's a little hazy, but I do remember seeing it, in my dorm.
And what has it meant to you as a feminist?
Oh, well, obviously, I'm still here. here, writing for Ms. Magazine as a regular contributor. So it has been really important. It's almost like a full circle moment for me, because I remember as an undergraduate, I was interested in going into journalism, and then I kind of switched and decided I want to teach. So I ended up actually working towards my PhD and then becoming a professor. So when Ms. reached out and said, we'd love for you to write, it really was an opportunity to kind of come back to my original goal, because now it's like, oh, okay, so I am doing teaching and journalism at the same time. So what that means for me as a feminist is that I'm able to actually combine those goals of teaching, of writing, of raising consciousness, because it's always been so important for me to be able to do that. And that Ms. did that consciousness raising for me, and I find myself doing the same thing, and especially not just in terms of my writing, but also how I also engage it in my teaching. I oftentimes involve my students. So, for example, with the Tubman 200 project, I had my students work with me in putting together a Tubman syllabus. I did the same thing this summer with the hip hop syllabus on Ms. My students also work with me with that as well. So I'm finding these ways of kind of just integrating the teaching and the writing and the overall, what I call consciousness raising, because we need so much of that.
Hello. Okay. I do the same thing. I think it's wonderful to use the magazine. It feels, makes it feel really immediate and exciting, and to get the students involved writing for the magazine as well. So our next panelist is Jackson Katz, who has a PhD from UMass. And UMass, right? You went to UMass? UCLA, sorry, undergrad UMass. Undergrad, I just associate you with UCLA. Has long been a major figure and thought leader in the growing global movement of men working to promote gender equality and prevent gender violence. He's the co-founder of the multiracial mixed gender Mentors in Violence Prevention, MVP, program, one of the longest running and most widely influential gender violence prevention programs in North America and beyond. MVP introduced bystander education to the sexual assault prevention field. Katz is one of its early architects. MVP was the first large-scale initiative in both the sports culture and the U.S. military. Katz has written several books, including The Macho Paradox. He is also the creator of several incredible films that we teach here at Smith, including Tough Guys 1 and 2, and we're waiting for number 3, Jackson. And then The Man Card, White Male Identity Politics from Nixon to Trump. Yeah, and he also has a TEDx talk, Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue, which has had more than 5 million views and been translated into 27 languages. So, and Jackson writes for the magazine. So, Jackson, when did you first encounter Ms., and what has it meant to you as a feminist?
Thank you, Carrie. I also want to say this is a great honor for me. I'm the guy at the end of the table, and they did make a space at the table for me. This was inadvertent, but that's a kind of a metaphor for my experience with Ms., which is it's so hard to get the stuff that I write published in mainstream publications, including left publications, let me add, including left publications that consider themselves progressive, but when it comes to feminism are at best liberal, and at worst standoffish and not at all what they need to be in terms of addressing feminism as one of the central organizing, principles for progressive social change. So Ms. has been welcoming in that sense. Ms., when I was, in college at UMass Amherst, so I was a philosophy major at UMass and a women's studies minor. I was the first man women's studies minor at UMass. And thank you. I thought it was a credential that made sense in this context. But anyways, I've been aware of Ms. even, I'm older than Janelle, so I was alive when Ms. was around, but I was more conscious and sentient of Ms. when I was a college student at UMass Amherst. By the way, Ann Ferguson was one of my key philosophy professors, and mentors at UMass. Anyhow, so it was those years in my college years, and then from that time on, I've seen Ms. as like this iconic presence, but all in the sort of the cultural conversation, but also as a resource. And I and many others, including men, have been reading Ms. for decades, and happily now I'm a contributing writer, so I've been writing pieces now regularly for the last several years, and Ms. is just like vital. It's a critical institution, and it needs to be much more widely read beyond the precincts of feminist activists and academics and intellectuals. And it is to a certain extent, but as Carrie and I have been in some dialogue about this, the stuff that's Ms. is publishing that other people aren't publishing needs to be like front and center in the cultural conversation as fascism rises here in the United States and in Europe, and a big part of the rise of fascism is anti-feminism and is misogyny embodied in right-wing populism. And Ms. is the place that has really paid attention to that in a way that other mainstream and progressive organs have not.
Thank you all. This is a wonderful introduction. So my next question is, I want to ask you about your writing for the magazine. Could you tell me maybe tell me about what you've been writing for the magazine? Maybe pick an article that you particularly thought was important and impactful, and speak a little bit about that. You can just go across.
I'll just keep being first then. It's okay. I have been thinking about this question, but I feel like for me, with my experience at Ms., so much of it also comes back to all the work that I was bringing in as an editor and working on as an editor. And I had the distinct honor of starting my time at Ms. In the middle of 2016. There was so little to talk about the whole time that I was there as the managing digital editor. There's just nothing going on. And we had so many different series that we brought to the website that just, we had the War on Women report. We were chronicling everything that was happening because it was so hard to keep track of everything that was happening between the years 2017 and 2020 when I became freelance. And we were doing work to bring a gender analysis. We were forming partnerships with nonprofit organizations and publishing work by them, but also always just putting a gender lens on everything that was happening. And I think when I think about the work I did in those years, it was that it felt like no one else was willing to have a conversation about how racism and sexism and toxic masculinity were forming this, just absolutely horrible, tragic situation that we were all living through, and how all of these pieces came together to shape what was happening in that moment, and how what needed to happen to push back against what was happening in that moment was a feminist response. And, it was a chance for us to just assert how vital all of those connections were to recognize and to have those conversations. And the goal was, of course, to make people realize that that was what was missing from all the other conversations and coverage that we were seeing from, the mainstream media that was too afraid to name what was really going on and who was really being attacked and what the real agenda was underneath all of the stuff that was going on. And I think, in the lead up to the 2016 election, we had such a focus on the Supreme Court and what was at stake for abortion, and the fact that Roe could be, hanging in the balance if the court tilted. And I think it was just, when you look through the collection, you see how prescient Ms. has been for 50 years, how they have often predicted something that would happen. And of course, at the time, everyone said, "You're crazy, you're being too dramatic, you're hysterical, go see a physician." And so I think, it was also a moment I think for me especially, I was obviously experiencing personally this wanting to just be like, we told you this would happen, and no one was listening to us, or it felt that way. So I think a lot of it too was about asserting with the reporting that, it was important to listen to the voices that can tell you what's about to happen and can tell you that they're at risk, and to listen to the people who are going to be in the crosshairs. And so I think in terms of that question, that's what sort of came up for me, was this idea of, the impact I hope we had was expanding the way people thought about everything that was happening in that whirlwind of a moment that, hopefully most of us have blacked out by now.
Yeah, and making them prepared for the resistance, to be informed as they're responding to what's happening. Loretta, what about you? Tell me about some of the things you've written and the impact.
Because I've been an activist for more than 50 years, I think I'll do it by decade. Because in the 70s, we were trying to get the perspectives of black women around violence against women out. So I was writing on black women and rape and domestic violence, and Ms. was always willing to get that out there. By the 90s, I was writing on reproductive justice and the need to organize women of color to, stand up. Because we marched with our feet. We would go to the clinics, but we didn't talk about going to the clinics. And so Billie Avery, who had founded the National Black Women's Health Project in 1984, after they organized the first conference in 83, she used to say, we got to break this conspiracy of silence. We got to break this conspiracy of silence. And so that's when a huge recruitment of getting women of color in general and black women in particular to tell their stories started happening with our, black and female workshops and stuff like that. And so the 90s would have been that, and I think my most recent piece submitted to Ms. would have been over the Pink Pussy March against Trump. Y'all remember we called it that because he said, grab him by the pussy. And we're like, no. Right, and so at that time, I actually wrote a scold, which I'm really good at scolding, because even though I hadn't really been paying attention to the organizing for the march, it became a dominant conversation among women of color not to participate because they didn't like the way it had been organized. And I was like, excuse me? Y'all are majoring in the minor. We're dealing with the threat of fascism and you're mad because nobody called you? You should have volunteered to be called if you understood the nature of the threat. And so I wrote a scold about, identitarian politics and being short-sighted. And, I'm always, as a black feminist, going to call out how white supremacy gets smuggled into our movement. But if you can't tell the difference between a problematic white ally and a Trump supporter, you got some work to do. And that was my point that I made in the article. I said, whatever trouble y'all have with the march organizers of the Pink Pussy March, you already know the number one thing you need to know about them. They didn't vote for Trump, that's why they're organizing the march. So get over yourself. And so I think that was my last piece. But I'm trying.
Keep it coming.
I'm so trying not to use my great-grandmother voice and scold, and that I have to call myself in a million times. And that's why I talk about the calling in culture so much around now. I'm like, y'all are figuring out how to cannibalize each other when we're about to be run over by the forces of fascism, like John just said. So
Thank you, Loretta.
I have to think decades. What was I thinking then?
Thank you. So Janelle, tell us about Beyonce.
Yeah, because that was easy. Yeah, I turned to this because this is the article. So, which is interesting because hearing Loretta talk about having a scold, I remember doing some scolding myself. around Beyonce's fierce feminism. It's one of those really interesting moments because I've written hundreds of articles, like Carrie. I've written so much for Ms., and I really enjoy being able to, put my thoughts, down on paper. But I was actually invited to write a piece about Beyonce. I learned from our senior editor, the late Michelle Court, that Ellie Spiegel saw Beyonce perform at the Super Bowl that year, 2013, and thought, I think she's a feminist. We should do something about it. So, Michelle actually came to me, would you write about Beyonce's feminism? At the time, it's interesting because I wasn't quite a fan, even though I'm not quite the Beehive, but I'm definitely squarely a fan now. And I really think so much of that has to do, this is what I mean about Ms. Ms. does consciousness raising, okay? Because I wrote the article, Beyonce's Fierce Feminism. All of these readers of Ms. excoriated the editors for putting Beyonce on the cover. That was my first cover story. I was away on a trip, actually, so I was coming back and going through all my messages, and I saw, oh, we have a problem. All these folks are mad that Beyonce is on the cover of Ms. I finally had to catch up and see what was going on, and I was just like, what? Here are these folks actually slut-shaming Beyonce. Like, what is this fur? I remember somebody who said, what is this fur-wearing stripper whore doing on the cover of Ms.? Oh, okay, so scolding. Oh my God, I said, I need to, it was a print issue, cover story, but now I had to go on the online platform and just really call out all these folks. And I actually wrote the piece called Regulating Women, the Bodies of Women of Color, called out the racism right out, and really got into, and it's so clear y'all didn't even read my article because I was critical about the ways in which she engages feminism, right? So that yielded hundreds of comments in response. And so, of course, I remembered this article more than anything because of that immediate response that I got to it. Like, what exactly was it about Beyonce that hit a nerve? And so here's something, what I love about our best 50 years, because I actually opened up to, this is my, here it is, page 270, 370, there we go. It's interesting reading it again because here's something that really stood out. I forgot I ended the article this way. I quoted a really cool Black feminist scholar, Aisha Shaida Simmons, who said, Beyonce just needs to wear a t-shirt that says, this is what a feminist looks like. Simmons suggests slyly. Maybe she'll wear it on her Mrs. Carter World Tour. And then my last sentence, I can see it now, lights on. Any questions? Following year, August 2014, MTV VMA Award, she stands in front of a feminist sign. I was like, there we go. Impact. She was reading this. So I like to claim that she saw, we called her a fierce feminist and she decided to embrace it. And she actually said that. I mean, she sampled Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's We Should All Be Feminists. And specifically in a behind the scenes video, she actually talked about searching through YouTube videos, looking for a really good video about feminism. And that's how she came across Adichie's We Should All Be Feminist TED Talk. And so that's why we get that sample in her Flawless. And so I actually have to, like I said, I like to claim that because I could have easily, one of the things I loved about Ms. reaching out to those of us in academia is they wanted us to reach a broader audience. They wanted us to write beyond the ivory tower, beyond our little peer-reviewed journals. Because I could have easily written something like this for an academic journal. And writing about Beyonce, not only did I have this impact on those who immediately had this reaction, but I could also say I had an impact even on, the pop star herself and everyone else who is engaging in these issues, because we are putting these ideas out into the public platform, into the public sphere, and it has an impact. And not only does it have an impact, it's because of that impact that those in academia then reached out to me. And so I've been writing forewords to different academic books about Beyonce, about popular culture. One of our premier peer-reviewed journals, Signs Journal, reached out to me to write a whole piece about celebrity feminism. So it really worked. It really worked out. So it's like, this wasn't keeping me away from my academic work. It was just expanding the audience, and again, expanding this feminist conscious, this raising that I really felt I was doing.
All right.
Thanks so much, Janelle. Jackson, what about you?
Well, I can't really follow that up with any level of celebrity, impact. Yeah, but the January 6th insurrection happened, and the mainstream coverage of that horrific event largely omitted a critical fact, which is to say, on January 6th, of the people arrested that day, or that were charged with crimes that day, 93% were white and 86% were men, but nobody talked about the 86% were men piece. Now, of course, race is a central issue, obviously, and with the rise of the right, but and the resistance to immigration and the ethnic diversification of this country, and this is also true in Europe. There's no doubt about that. It's a central piece. But another central piece is that men's reaction against the loss of cultural centrality in the family and in the larger society is an animating part of the right-wing populism and Trumpism. And if we don't talk about that, we're missing a huge part of what's happening in the world, and including in our society. And people weren't talking about that, and they weren't writing about that in the mainstream or in progressive media. And it was very frustrating to me, for example, to listen to and watch, whether it's MSNBC or The Nation or other organs of sort of progressive journalism, talking about the racial aspect and not the gender aspect, and we say we believe in intersectionality. We have to talk about both and other issues as well. It's because it's all part of the same picture. And so I ended up doing a sort of a dialogue with my friend and colleague Jeremy Earp, who's the production manager at the Media Education Foundation. My colleagues and I at the Media Education Foundation, and Ms. published it 2 days after. So January 8th, 2001, Ms. published this dialogue where we were. In the dialogue, Jeremy and I were centering the idea that we have to talk about men, and white men in particular, because it's not just white people, it's white men who are at the center of Trumpism and right-wing populism. And so that was, an example of how Ms. would give a platform in the ways that other media wouldn't. And by the way, people always say to me, or often say to me, well, this is really good stuff, but the guys that you need to reach aren't reading Ms. And my reaction is like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. Good point. Thank you for pointing that out. The reason why Ms. is taking the stuff that I and others are writing, the other places aren't. The New York Times and the Atlantic and Politico and even The Nation, a lot of those journals of communication are not putting forth this level of analysis. They're just not, with exceptions. I mean, and by the way, I'm still in a world where when I get a piece published somewhere other than Ms., people congratulate me. Like, oh my God, you got that piece in? You got that piece into a mainstream conversation? This is about men's violence against women. And people say this is a huge issue, and they agree that it's a huge issue. But a man like myself getting a piece published on it is seen as an achievement, which is pathetic. There's been incredible gatekeeping in the progressive media and in the mainstream media of feminist and pro-feminist positions on men's violence against women, and then, of course, populism. And Ms. is the exception, and I think it's great. And that's why one of the reasons why I'm here, and championing Ms., which I would have done even if they weren't putting my stuff forward. And I really appreciate that.
You're not going to mention the article about Ken?
Do you want me to? Should I?
Just quickly.
Oh my God. How many people here did not see the Barbie movie? Okay. 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 She just gave me permission to do a spoiler, you know. No, it's not really a spoiler. I was just curious. I don't, oh my God. I mean, that's another whole discussion. I know that we can't do it justice here. I thought the Barbie movie was the greatest feminist hack of popular culture in human history. But the piece that I wrote was about Ken, the Ken storyline in the Barbie movie, which I thought was incredibly interesting and empathetic. I mean, people can agree or disagree. I understand that, you know, there's multiple readings of, you know, media texts, but I thought it was rather empathetic with Ken and Ken's experience. And one of the things, I'll just give one point that might be relevant to this conversation. Ken, when he went to the real world and noticed that patriarchy worked for men, white men in particular, but men, and he brought that back to Barbie world. In other words, patriarchy, which meant violence as well as male privilege, and it didn't go well. And it didn't go well either for Ken or for any of the other men. And I think that's a really important point, because I think a lot of men are struggling to find ways of connecting and being, you know, seen and being in connection in relationships, including heterosexual relationships with women. And I think a lot of men are stumbling and not knowing how to do that. And the patriarchal answer is a horribly destructive and no-go place. And I think the Ken storyline made that point. It also made the point that violence is not the solution to problems, both interpersonally and politically. And when they went from the violence to the dance scene, they made it a satirical, I thought, takedown of the idea that violence was somehow redemptive or somehow positive. And I thought that all this stuff was a sophisticated way of bringing up important subject matter. And for the next 30 years, people are going to be talking about the Barbie movie, and it is a text that we can then discuss and debate, including the role of men in feminism and men in gender justice.
See how
I should
fun
mention
this
there are
is?
quite a few articles in Ms. about Barbie, so definitely check it out. I think I wrote a little piece as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Ms. does culture, it does politics, it does fascism, it does voting rights, gerrymandering, the filibuster, you know, social movements around the world. It's global. We have the print magazine, which comes out 4 times a year, ad-free. It's a nonprofit, Ms. Magazine. But we also have the digital content, and they put out about 5 articles a day, and you can get on either a daily email list or a weekly email list with the top stories and keep up on not just the news, but a feminist take on the news and what's happening in the world, and things that you won't read in mainstream magazines. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to the audience, so be thinking about your questions. But I want to ask, and you don't have to go in order this time, I promise, I won't make you go in order. At this time of backlash to women's progress, and at a time of attacks on women's rights here and around the world, and threats to democracy, what lessons can we take away from the last 50 years of Ms. and movement building to fuel our movement forward? Given the failure of mainstream media to deal with rising authoritarianism and the myriad anti-democratic impulses that are part of our political landscape now through a feminist lens, do you see that Ms. can play a key role going forward?
This time I'll volunteer. I mean, I think as someone who is not as old as Ms., it's a scary time for, I'm sure, many people, but there's that shock of realizing that, you know, it's today and different people have less rights than they did, you know, when I was turning 5. And it just feels awful to be going backwards. And it feels, you know, and it does feel like what we're facing is unprecedented, that, now there's no rules, no way forward. How are we going to figure it out? And I think that's something that is so powerful about the collection and has been so powerful about being part of Ms. and, having Ellie and Kathy there as mentors and guides and all of the Ms. scholars and just being part of the community of Ms. is that this book is proof that we have been here before and we won and we made progress and that we know how to do that. We know how to come together. We know how to find solutions. We know how to stay strong. We know how to be resilient. And we know how to outmaneuver the people who seek to destroy us and what we're trying to build and the feminist future that we know is possible. And so I think for me, the lesson from the 50 years of Ms. is that there is so much hope and optimism in this book. A lot of people at our book events will say, I can't believe we're back here again. I can't believe, we're still talking about Roe v. Wade and abortion rights, or we're still talking about LGBTQ rights, or, the unfair burdens of motherhood on women and all of that. And yes, it's frustrating, but I think, we've come so far and there's now so many of us in this room and we're a majority movement. And I think it's just so powerful to, flip through these pages and know that there are actually answers in here and pathways forward in here. And so I think that's been a really incredible part of the book and one of the biggest takeaways for me.
Do you have the last word? I actually have been thinking about that question a lot. Just beyond this panel, I actually think about when I started in 2010, because that was when Carrie and I went through the workshop. It was also the first time I actually wrote for Ms. I started out with the digital platform before I wrote my first print article. And I realized that was a crucial moment. 2010, that's when Ms. started the digital platform. It's also the same year that we had a blog like the Crunk Feminist Collective. And so we were really driving feminist conversations online. And that was really important because then you could actually trace the impact. I'm talking about celebrity impact, but just regular impact. I'm thinking of how terms that were once in academia, like intersectionality and misogynoir. That was us putting that out into the conscious. And so I know that we have impact, and that's why this work is so important. And I know that we have to keep doing this work, especially because I think there has also been this erosion of just general mainstream media and journalism. You just don't see the depth in investigative journalism. You don't get the good questions. And when I think of what happened with regards to 2016, that fateful year, so much of that was backlash. It was backlash because we were driving feminists consciousness out into the public. And so I think we have to also prepare for backlash, because as much as we're excited to see the consciousness raise it, we also have to recognize folks are always pushing back against that. And so we just need to be aware of that as well. But I just think that we were able to do so much just in that time span, because I do remember seeing how we were driving a lot of consciousness, even if it's just through digital culture, but then also recognizing the backlash was happening, and not just the backlash happening, they were doing it. Gamergate, for example, was a pushback against feminists. And not only that, they were some of the architects behind that movement of the MAGA movement, the Trump movement. They were borrowing our language. So you could actually see, oh, look at them. They're actually pretending to be black feminists. And so they just took our language. Critical race theory, coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, they take our language and just use it against us. So we always have to keep in mind that that particular backlash, that pushing back, that we always have to push harder. So, but to keep doing it, because the impact is there, and I'm proud of that impact. But I know that this is the work that Ms. has to do.
Well, in the spirit of Ms's activist mission, because Ms is not just a journalistic institution, but it's a movement institution. We've been discussing this. I'll make an activist statement. We need more men who have the guts to start standing up and speaking out and challenging other men's sexism and misogyny and racism, and white men in particular. We need more white men who are joining with women and white women and women of color and in multiracial coalitions, but being strong and being loud about it. And I think there's a lot of good men and a lot of progressive men and a lot of men who are supportive, generally speaking, of feminist goals. Again, I understand it's more complicated than that one headline, but I think there's a lot of men who are supportive, but they've been quietly supportive, and they saw that their role was to be privately supportive of women in their lives and, vote for the right candidate, but they haven't really had a public voice. And I think this is a mistake. I think we need, because if people like me and my good friend Rob Oken, who is the longtime editor of Voicemail magazine, who's right there. Rob, could you just raise your hand? Rob was putting together Voicemail magazine, which I termed and we called the Ms. magazine of the pro-feminist men's movement. And because it was is an organ of communication that helps people reach each other with ideas and connecting points like Ms. does. But one of the things that we talked about, Rob and I have talked about, and others have talked about for years, is that people don't even know that pro-feminist men exist. They don't even know that we exist. And you have a new narrative that's happening in the last few years about, men and white men and crisis and all that kind of stuff. And it's almost, and that includes, by the way, some feminist women who don't even know that there have been men who have been talking about, writing about, and organizing on these matters, including men's violence against women, for decades. But because we haven't had the public platform, because we haven't been in the media. Anyways, I just think that that's one thing that Ms. will do, and I'll do it, and Rob will do it, and others will do it, and Ms. is one vehicle where we can actually get our sort of ideas out into the dialogue, into the discourse, and in particular, we need to figure out ways to reach more men who, again, are going to not be silent any longer in the face of the rise of fascism. And by the way, we don't need, the mass movement of progressive sort of feminist change that's going to hopefully prevent fascism in this country and in Europe and other places, it's going to be led by a multiracial coalition of women, but we need a critical mass of men. We don't need, I don't think there was going to be a mass movement of men. I think we need a critical mass of men, and that means a lot of the men who are already supportive need to step up their game. That's what I think.
Yeah, thanks. Jackson, help us recruit more men to write for the magazine and speak out. And let's think about ways of trying to reach those communities with the magazine. Like Ms. has this great program that puts Ms. into women's prisons. Let's be putting it into men's prisons.
Amen, amen. Actually, I'm just a quick point. The men's health movement, the growing movement of recognizing that, gendered ideas about manhood, however you want to define that, harm men's emotional, mental, physical, and sexual health. The men's health movement, which gets a lot of traction, even on the right, gets a lot of traction. Guess where it came from? The feminist-led women's health movement. The men's health movement is a direct outgrowth of the women's-led, feminist-led women's health movement, and some of the major figures in the field of men's health openly credit feminist women's leadership with giving them the intellectual architecture and cultural sort of space to talk about men's health. How many people have ever heard that, what I just said? How many people have ever heard that in the mainstream media or in the podcast world, that the feminist-led women's health movement, which started, by the way, one of the key moments was the Boston Women's Health Book Collective publication of Our Bodies, Ourselves in like 1972, that was one of the driving forces behind today's greater attention to men's health. And we need to say that, including in right-wing media and including in mainstream media, and because a lot of men will be like, oh my God, I never heard that, I never thought that. They just think, feminism cares about women, which obviously it does, but it's also given us a narrative about and an intellectual sort of explanation for men's lives, and both on a personal level and on a systemic level. Basic stuff, this needs to be out there.
I'm so glad I had a chance to follow Jackson, because I really do remember in the early anti-rape movement when we used to beg men, because you can't stop rape by only bandaging victims, you gotta go to the source. And so, the Prisoners Against Rape, which became the first male-led organization to work on against violence against women, and they were incarcerated for having raped and murdered women. And then I remember we may have even been at some of those men and masculinity conferences of the day so there's a real question of why men don't take women's human rights seriously that really needs to be discussed. And that's on the left. I'm not even talking about on the right. But let me talk about the right, because they're my favorite people to pick on. One of the evidences I saw to backlash was not only how the media manipulated Hillary Clinton, where they made this false equivalence between this BS around emails and Trump's obvious corruption and misogyny and stuff. So, and they're doing it again around Biden's tennis shoes and January 6th, like there's this whole thing. So I don't think that's accidental. I don't think they do it because they don't know any better. I think it serves their profit motives. That's the only thing I can think of. Because y'all are too smart not to figure out what an elementary school can see, that there's a difference between somebody wearing tennis shoes and trying to overthrow democracy. I mean, really? Y'all can make big money to be that dumb. So I consider it a plan. But when you say backlash, the image that popped into my mind, and this is where Ms. Magazine and other feminists and pro-feminist organizations come in. I go back to the Kavanaugh hearings. And that was because it took me a while, because I've got a hard head, but I realized that for decades we've been telling our abortion stories, talking about the harm we're going to feel if Roe is overturned. I mean, we've been saying that like a drum. First, the thing was getting women to come out the closet to tell their stories. There was that first, because we had that conspiracy of science. But once we did, and particularly when the third wave started picking up with abortion speak-outs and telling their stories and all of that, it was welcome. But during the Kavanaugh hearings, I don't know if I, got cynical or not. Well, Lily Tomlin said, no matter how cynical you get, you can't keep up. But I don't know if I got cynical, because I said, it's not a matter that they don't know. We have to fight the fact that they don't care. And that's a different project, because we can't do an empathy transplant like we do heart transplants. I'm like, now how do we reformulate our strategies for what is an eliminationist movement? Because we've been fighting on the assumption that if we could just strike that chord of empathy and humanity in them and tell our stories and tell about the 10-year-old and do this and do that, that they would wake up and say, I don't want to be that asshole. Now they're delighting in being the assholes. Shamelessness is now getting you elected to office. Outrageousness, crossing every boundary, is a way to get attention and manipulate yourself into power. So the question becomes for the women's movement, How are we going to change, given that the old standards of political discourse have been blown out by Trumpism and neo-fascism? We just can't keep telling our stories and say, I hope they listen, I hope they listen, I hope they listen. I want to keep telling our stories and using myths, but I want to talk about and learn from other countries that have dealt with fascism, how we can change our tactics as a women's movement, because this is unlike anything we've dealt with before, and our usual feminist strategies are woefully inadequate for this historical moment.
Thank you so much, Loretta. So we're now going to open it up for questions, and our wonderful Max is going to pass the mic around. So any questions?
Well, what you just said kind of segued into the question I had, which is, given that the right wing gets so amplified in the media and Twitter and in places like that, what can we do on our end? And I think direct this more to Carmen because she's, worked in digital platforms. What's the process for amplifying your message in today's crazy media environment where, you go on Twitter? I mean, I turned my Twitter account off because, it's like the shouting down that happens in so much of social media, which is where people are consuming news. So what do we do to get our message amplified? Or is our message so positive that it just doesn't appeal to whatever it is that gets people all stoked up in social media?
A good question. Thank you. I'm also, if anyone else has anything to add, would love to hear what some other folks think. But I think it just makes me think about some of the challenges that we've had at Ms. As we were developing, the website and our digital platforms, there's always this idea of, when it comes to journalistic endeavors, in so many ways, we're very outnumbered by news organizations that have massive resources and huge staffs, and they're able to, get something done within 5 minutes of something happening. And so there was always this challenge of feeling like we could not respond fast enough. We could not be able to respond fast enough. But I started realizing, too, that it didn't always matter, especially, during the Trump years, it felt like sometimes by the time we finally had the response ready, the mainstream media had moved on to some other horrific thing that had occurred, some other policy change or, new soundbite that was circulating, new conflict to chase, new interesting story to put out there. But people were actually so hungry for the feminist response that no one else was providing that it was almost timeless. We could put it out there whenever, and it was like people were just so hungry. It didn't matter that, it had taken a few days for us to get the piece up, or that, the person had classes and couldn't work on it until, 2 days later, or whatever it was. And I think right now with what I see on social media, I actually am very hopeful that there is this new generation of Gen Z and Gen Alpha feminists who are taking over on platforms like TikTok. And I think for me, the one thing that I want to be able to do is bridge a gap for them to help them realize how much work has already been done, which I think is why collections like these are so valuable. Just this idea that we sometimes aren't even finding each other, so we feel like we're reinventing the wheel, starting the conversation all over again, reiterating the same sort of information because we don't realize that that information or that hypothesis has already been shared. But I think as the conversation expands, that's what'll happen. I have a lot of hope about our ability to dominate those spaces, but I also think that it's never gonna be a good idea for us to try to be the most popular thing on these corporate-owned spaces that we now know, like when we talk about Twitter, can literally disappear in a day because a man can just come in and decide he's going to destroy the entire infrastructure that has allowed us to share information and have conversations and find each other. And so I think it's also about building up platforms like Ms. to allow community to form in spaces that are explicitly feminist. You know, if there's a Truth Social, which God knows what it looks like on there, then there need to be online spaces and physical spaces where feminists can come together. You know, it's still gonna be vital that instead of just being in that large marketplace of ideas that's dominated by people with power, and people with connections and resources and some kind of status, that we have our own spaces to come together and actually do the organizing and the consciousness raising and the bringing people in.
Great points, and I just want to add that, you know, you got to keep, whether they have a bigger platform or not, you got to keep talking, you got to push back. You mentioned the platform formerly known as Twitter, and it made me think of Black Twitter in particular, because one of the things I loved about Black Twitter is that we would just turn things around, we'd flip the script, and that's the whole point. Even if you got to take somebody who's being, you know, fascist or a real asshole, as Loretta pointed out, you got to take some little piece and really, really dig at them. Really dig at them, really get at them, so then you make them self-conscious and there's no getting. It's kind of like how the termite always has to bring down the elephant. You got to think about, you know, what are the things that you can pick at, because people are vulnerable regardless. Now, what is interesting, you know, you brought up Trumpism and whatnot. One of the things that I always thought was interesting about him is, I remember in the Obama years, and Obama always had to be so, you know, calm and, you know, never show his anger as a Black man who was president of the United States. So Keel and Peele used to do that anger translator thing. Trump is the anger translator of a lot of people. That's who he is. And I realized, so, you know, Obama needed an anger translator. Trump is the anger translator. And I think we need to think about what it is about what made that permissible. Because it's his shamelessness, you know, that has a certain kind of appeal. And of course, the shamelessness comes from the very fact that it's precisely because his predecessor was a Black man that he could be who he is. So we're dealing with that because it's like, once the Black man showed that he could be poised and calm and whatnot, the white man had to show that I can be everything and not that. And that his white male privilege allows him to be as shameless as he wants to be. And he is an anger translator for a lot of people, because all of a sudden folks are like, oh, okay, I don't have to be that horrible, you know, racist. He's going to do that for me. And I think that's very interesting that we're dealing with that. So that's the person that we have to pick apart, because they also have such an inflated ego that you could easily pop a pin in that. So we just have to keep, you know, voicing our concerns, raising our voices, and whether or not they have bigger platforms, you know, use what you can. So Black Twitter is an interesting example because they've always done that. They always find ways to do memes, to do all kinds of, you know, just this kind of humor that, well, humor always works. If you can laugh at somebody, that's one important way of bringing down power, so.
I think we have time for one more question. Anybody have a question? Oh, yay, yeah, or.
Hi, I was wondering if you guys could speak to like community infighting kind of. Professor Ross, you discussed that with the post-Trump women's marches kind of being perhaps organized poorly, but then us as a movement kind of cannibalizing each other, because I think that's one of the biggest issues with young people's movements, is that we can argue about so many things and you can say one wrong thing and then you're canceled. And so like, how can we build movements that actually do work together, and that kind of where we can learn to actually have peaceful conflict resolution in a time where it's so easy to be so reactionary?
I'm so glad you asked that question. It's almost as if I paid you. Yeah. after doing social justice work for 50 years, in 2015, Carrie and I here at Smith Campus started asking the question whether or not how we do the work is as important as the work that we do. Because we were becoming increasingly aware of the call-out culture, particularly on campus, but also throughout society. It would be wrong to just say it's young people and social media. I mean, the original definition of a call-out killed Alexander Hamilton, I mean, for God's sake. You can't blame that on Twitter. I mean, really? But what I would recognize is that we've taught radical consciousness without radical love practices. And so people use their newfound consciousness and weaponize it against each other. And sometimes because they can't fight neoliberal racialized capitalism, but they can get their boss or teacher fired, that's what they go for. And so I've been leading online trainings on this, leading forums here at Smith on it, trying to create this culture shift at Smith in particular, but all other campuses too, because I just did UMass a couple of days ago, where the best way we're going to fight fascism is to stop turning on each other. And I think a lot of people are turning on each other because they don't know how to do it better. They're using their radical consciousness to hold their organizations or their colleges or whatever accountable, but at the same time, it deflects from the more serious threat, the larger threat. Yeah, maybe somebody doesn't know, messes up and gets the gender pronoun wrong, but they're not the ones that are out here killing trans people. Can you tell the difference? And doesn't that difference matter? All right, and so these are the kinds of conversations with the calling in, the calling out culture that I'm trying to do. I teach it online, $5 if anybody's interested. I call myself the Walmart of consciousness raising. $5, you can learn how to call people in. But the reality is that it's urgently needed because we've got to figure out how to make calling in and turning to each other as important in the 21st century as nonviolence was in the 20th century. A statement of our values, a statement of how we want to walk through the world. And actually relating to the previous questioner, I find that when you organize people with joy, love, and respect, they want to stay in that movement. When you organize them with anger, blaming, and guilt, they want to run from that movement. And so if we can understand the power of love, I keep telling all the students, I say, y'all are good at quoting Audre Lorde bell hooks, but do y'all believe them? Because they're always talking about the power of love. So don't just give me the quote, give me some practice around believing them.
Thank you, Loretta. Thank you. So we've come to the end of our time, but I would like to invite everybody upstairs for a reception and book signing. And if you haven't gotten your book, make sure you get one on the way out. And I also just want to thank Joe Hay, an artist who painted the Gloria picture up front. It's so beautiful. And Joe gave us these posters, which I'm going to give to each of the panelists. Beautiful posters of the painting that's out in the hallway. And Joe has her work, she's from the Cape Cod, and there's a gallery in Provincetown of her work. She paints not just Gloria, but many of the feminists we know and love. So thank you. Where is Joe? Are you? Yes, right there, Joe. And next to Joe is the owner of the gallery. Remind me of your name?
Michelle from Women
Yes, Women Crafts in Provincetown. So thank you so much for these posters, and thank you for sharing your work out in the lobby. And make sure everybody get a book, but also the bookmarks have a QR code that you can use to get a free year subscription to the print magazine. But I also want to urge you to subscribe online for the digital content as well. You will hear the kinds of things that you heard today on this panel, just brilliant commentary about the state of the world and what we need to do to make it better. So thank you all very much, and thank you, panelists.